So, the gratitude to Michael and Samir for inviting me here today and for that wonderful introduction. I am going to be speaking about China. Before I do, I also want to echo the other comment made that obviously any views that I'm presenting today are my own and do not represent those of any of the organizations with which I am affiliated. So I'm a China specialist. I work primarily in China military and security issues. So what I want to present today are some views of how China is seeing the development of the Indian military. I think Gurmeet set it up very nicely to show you what India is actually up to. And I think it's uncontroversial to say, to a degree, that India is clearly balancing against China. But scholars that work on China primarily also agree that China is not responding militarily to India's rise to the degree that we would expect it to, as political scientists, but also as policymakers. If you look at what the Chinese are doing and what they say, they actually are responding with surprising mildness to some of the developments, specifically along the border. The People's Liberation Army, their ground posture is relatively restrained compared to the forces assembled in other regions. Their Air Force is improving to a degree, but for the most part, they don't have any bases that are close, permanently hosted bases that are close to the border. And lastly, I would say that in the reorganization, given the fact that the Western Theater Command, which is in charge of dealing with India, primarily the border issues, the fact that this theater command is landlocked and therefore doesn't have an associated navy suggests that China is not optimizing its force structure primarily with India in mind. But most telling, I think, is the way that China responds to other countries that are not India. It shows how special really India is in the Chinese mindset. China responds to other countries that are smaller and that present a less dynamic threat to China in very severe fashions. However, when India engages in military modernization or exercises or activities, the Chinese respond very mildly. If you look at comparing the Indian defense budget with potentially the budget is not as high as some people in India would wish it is, but the budget is 10 times more than that of Vietnam and the Philippines and 17% greater than that of Japan. The Indian Navy has 120 more active ships than Japan, 139 more than the Philippines, 146 more than Vietnam. India's Air Force has almost 10 times as many active aircraft as those of Vietnam and the Philippines, and almost twice as many of those in the Japanese self-defense forces. Now, this is only quantitative. It obviously doesn't address some of the qualitative issues. But this is just to make the point that in comparison to Vietnam and the Philippines in particular, India presents a greater military challenge to China. However, when those two countries, Vietnam or the Philippines, engage in any types of activities, however minor, or engage in procurement or development of any systems, however minor, the Chinese official response is extremely harsh. They take that as a threat to their sovereignty, and they will come out in public statements as well as having these nationalistic editorials in their newspapers about the nefarious intentions and how Vietnam and the Philippines plan on taking over Asia. However, when India engages in similar types of activities, and in some ways in a way that is even more advanced than that of these countries, the response is actually quite mild. If you look at, for example, specifically how the Indian military is portrayed in the Chinese media, articles that have been published in the People's Daily and in the Global Times show that China is paying attention to the Indian military modernization. So their lack of response isn't because of lack of attention. However, even though they cover all the procurement and the modernization efforts that are occurring, they rarely mention China as a reason for the arms buildup. Instead, even when it's obvious to even the most amateur military analysts that certain things are being done, particularly to deal with the Chinese threat along the border, the Chinese military papers will instead cite rapid economic growth, persistent tension with Pakistan, domestic terrorist threats, and other reasons for why India is engaging in these activities. The Chinese media will also cover the Indian military in a way that underplays India's progress, usually making an unfavorable comparison to Chinese military modernization. So I think we have a picture, and many of us in the room that study this issue know that India does present some real challenges to China. And even maybe some of the most advanced systems, for example, when India revealed its first indigenous carrier, or some of the advancements that they've made with nuclear submarine technology. When China talks about these advancements, they, instead of highlighting the impressiveness of them, or potentially even the threat they pose to China, they downplay how powerful those would be. They talk about how easily detectable the Indian submarines are, how the carrier is a joke compared to other carriers in the region, and they tend not to include any coverage of how certain systems, especially modernization in strategically sensitive areas like missile development, how any of these developments might potentially impact China. So, for example, on the BrahMos missile, which has clear implications for China, the way it was covered in China was to say that the reason India developed this was because of their weak fighter force, and that the missile was relatively ineffective, given that India doesn't have an expanded C4ISR network. More recently, when India tested for the fourth time the Agni-5 ICBM capable of hitting every major target in China, the Chinese media noted that much testing is needed before it could be operational, and that because of its speeds, it doesn't constitute a credible threat. When they talk about some of these developments, they also like to point out that a lot of the equipment or modernization efforts that are being undertaken in India are driven by procurement from other countries. It's very important in the Chinese narrative that it downplays India's own achievements. And the main reason that China presents criticizes and says that Indian modernization is not continuing the pace it should is that they criticize the domestic political system. And they emphasize the inherent inefficiency in the political system. And so it's a mantra in a lot of Chinese talking points about the Indian military to say, one, the Indian military relies very heavily on outside countries for weapons. Two, the different weapons from different countries that the Indian military procures leaves it with a less effective fighting force. And three, the weapons they end up procuring are such low quality and their own defense industry is so backwards that India will never catch up to China. These types of viewpoints also extend not only to the procurement, but also exercises that are being done on the border. It's very surprising, again, when China is so sensitive, especially to cooperation between the United States and other partners in the region, that when India engages in exercises with the United States, the Chinese response actually doesn't present any sort of nationalistic ire or even commentary. For a large part, they will blame the United States and other countries for tricking India into participating in these balancing type of measures, but that India itself has no desire to actually do so. If you look at the white papers that China puts out, they mention India just as often as other countries, but they mention India in the context of cooperation with China, and they don't actually mention the arms buildup. So this is, I think, a very interesting pattern, and I would say that it's not because some of the maybe conventional wisdom is the Chinese are, they're not concerned about the Indian military, they're not concerned about the Indian threat. But parallel to all this discussion about how ineffective the Indian military is and how slow their modernization is another discussion about how nefarious Indian intentions are. Most of the discussion within China will make broad claims that India basically plans and hopes to take over the whole Asian region, including the Indian Ocean, where there is a budding rivalry. So these two narratives, in my mind, are kind of contradict each other, in which they will present the idea that India has these goals of greatness, but then, on the other hand, they will say India will fail to reach these lofty goals because of their inefficiencies in governance. So my main argument that I make about these patterns, and to conclude about what it means for U.S. policy, for Indian military modernization, is that I think there's something very special about China and how it feels it has to respond to India. Most recently, just this April, when the Chinese Navy and the Indian Navy cooperated to rescue a ship from Somali pirates, everyone was surprised by the fact that the Chinese reporting left out the Indian role. But this is actually very common given the patterns that I've laid out to you. I would argue that China finds it necessary to downgrade any progress that India has made, primarily because of regime legitimacy. That domestically they have an argument that the only way that they can modernize and rise the way they have is because they've maintained the domestic political system they currently have. And such progress would not be possible with the domestic political system that India has. And that's why they find it so important to highlight the fact that India is not doing well, even to, I would say underplay, underestimate, there's a bias there, but also highlight the reasons for any of the problems India has is because of the domestic political system. What this means for policy is that I think the threshold for what the Indian military would have to develop, and also the degree to which the United States and India is cooperating, the threshold at which China would actually respond is higher than most policymakers expect it to be, within the United States at least. There is this counterbalancing force, which prohibits the Chinese from admitting that there's any developments of concern in India. So I think this means there's actually more room to maneuver in India to modernize, to protect their own security interests, especially along the border. I also think this means that because China isn't responding tit for tat, that arms races between China and India are actually unlikely. And so I would argue that while the current administration's policy towards Asia is still unfolding, it's still unclear, a lot of my research suggests that the best way to encourage India and potentially cooperate with India in a hedging strategy against China, as Gurmeet mentioned in his presentation, would be to help India more from afar. Because the more the United States is a part of that narrative, the more that China can blame the United States and maybe respond to India than if it's just India. And so with that, I will conclude, and I look forward to further discussion and question and answers.